And just to finish on, I don't know whether you can read this. Can you read that at the back? I think this is just a summary of what I've been trying to say effectively, that everything in that green is everything that we're responsible for, probably in terms of the built environment. That the actual design of buildings is just one component of that, but all the other things there we need to be thinking about as well. And that's what our role as urban designers are, and that's what we have to think about. And I think, you know, you as architects obviously is responsible as well. And as I say, my time at JASMAX has made me realise that so many of the architects have already got that actually, so which is really encouraging. So just finally, four main steps in sort of becoming an urban designer, or the role of an urban designer. I think first of all is fundamentally just accepting the importance of place. You either get that or you don't. You either understand the need to get involved in place because of those major challenges that I talked about earlier, and once you've got that, you know, lights on, then you can start actually doing something about it. But I think we've still got a way to go in that respect, particularly central government level, as I say. Having accepted and acknowledged that sort of need of place and the importance of place, it's then a sort of understanding how places work, and there's a particular skill involved in that. And then having the design skills to be able to make a difference, and I think obviously that's where architects are particularly skilled, and I've seen that in the office. Actually putting that into practice, once we start getting into designing places, it's working out the practical elements of it. But the biggest difference probably is that just having the skills to make it happen. This is the role of the urban designer isn't necessarily in designing things, it's actually designing a framework to allow quality places to emerge. It's to allow the designers who are doing the individual components, the landscape architects, the utilities, it's actually designing a framework, designing policies that actually allows all that to come together to create these great places. And that's probably the main difference between an urban designer and an architect, I think, is actually thinking about how to make these frameworks, how to facilitate good placemaking. There we go.
Thank you, Alistair. Perfect timing. I guess that we'll all need to go a little bit easy at the afternoon tea after that. All those stats on our health. But at this point, I'd like to invite our three questioners to come to the stage. Graham Scott, Amanda Hyde-de Kretser, and Gary Lawson. Graham, of course, well known to you, Director of ASC Architects, well known for his involvement in things urban. Amanda Hyde, of course, known to you from her academic background, now at Housing New Zealand, and Gary Lawson of Stevens Lawson. So I don't know whether one of you would like to introduce some suitable pithy or otherwise comment to begin proceedings. Graham, perhaps you might...
You spoke about barriers to good urban design, Alistair, and you know, it was, I thought your analysis was spot on, but I should just relay to this particular audience more than once, probably 3 times in the last 3 years, I've been in meetings like this where the architect has mostly been blamed for the lack of good urban outcomes. Guys have stood up, women have stood up saying that the problem with our cities is that architects are completely object-focused and can't see beyond the building they're designing. Planners just deal in words and in fact turned into lawyers. And the only people left to save the city are landscape architects. And in those audiences, probably I was one of just a handful of architects, but you all need to know that, I think, because we've got to get out there and push the urban design message, as Alistair has very clearly relayed it, really fast. Otherwise, we're going to lose ground, hand over fist. How do you react to that, Alistair?
Yes, it was a point I was actually going to mention. Couldn't fit everything in, obviously. I think it's a fair assumption. Having spent the first 40, 50 years of my career working in local government on the sort of receiving end of planning applications, resource consents, that I think particularly even in local government, there misconception that the architects don't quite know what they're doing. That the architects are submitting these things that just don't pay enough heed to the context of the site. And I think it still exists in Auckland City as well, that there's a view that, you know, it is the architects that you know, need to wake up a little bit. But as I say, I think moving to JASMAX last year, I think has you know, completely opened my eyes in that respect. That the knowledge, certainly within JASMAX, on sort of context and urban design issues and the bigger picture has been quite startling, actually, to the point that, as I say, I just wondered what I was going to offer in the company. I think everybody knows everything already. And obviously in my involvement with more and more architects recently around the city has you know, sort of backed that up. So I do believe that the biggest barriers are the processes that we have to work with.
Sure.
And yes, we do have to work on communication and getting that across to those people who've still got that sort of misguided notion.
I'd like to pick that up a bit more. I think one of the incredibly interesting things about your presentation was that you talked a lot about the whole way we talk about urban design as a whole series of objects. You sort of talked about, you know, we standardly hear the idea of the street and the idea of the open space and the idea of the park, and there's different people who design each piece. And then you sort of then went on to talk about the whole issue of how we really need to spend more time dealing with cohesion, and we need to include, etc. And what seems to be incredibly interesting is that we're in this position where I guess things are separated for us all of the time. When we're in a regulatory environment where we actually have to deal with the rules of the street, we then have to deal with the rules of other things. And very often the role of the architect, and this comes from a woman who I used to read a lot about, Catherine Ingraham, who talked about the role of the architect actually really is dealing with re-establishing proper relationships between things. And that so often as architects we come into a situation where in fact the urban relationships, the relationship between the street and the site, the relationship between even what you're doing inside and what you're doing outside seem to have been broken down. And sometimes those relationships are so broken that it demands extremely interesting architecture or challenging architecture to re-establish those proper relationships. I guess the question is then, perhaps not necessarily to you, but to everybody, is how do we actually go back into the regulatory environment and stop having to respond to writing our reports on how we're dealing with a street or how we're dealing with parking, etc. Is there another mechanism by where we can actually have a responsibility to report on our projects by reporting on how people live? There was again, another architect, I remember sort of saying the way we should be designing the city is so that we go out there and we ask, when we see a little boy crying, why are you crying? And then design the city so he may cry well. At some level, we need to do that. We actually need to go out and say, what are people really wanting to do in the city, and how do we design a city, how they do that? And I think it's quite simple, actually, dealing with that focus of living or the people and what you actually do. You get to places you need to go, you want to interact with people, and at some level, one of the things that I think is really forgotten in urban design is at some level we also want to withdraw and become an individual again, almost leave behind the rules of the community and actually just be what we are. And often, particularly when we start to get involved in intensification, that withdrawal process that actually in intensified housing there may not be some space for that to take place. How do we actually establish in the city places for us to withdraw well as well?